She hadn't set foot in this town for over a decade, not since the scandal tore her family apart and forced her into exile. To some, she was a memory best forgotten. To others, a ghost wrapped in shame and silence. But today, as the church bells tolled for the man who raised her, she returned. Not to mourn, but to reclaim the truth buried beneath years of whispers and betrayal. Her heels clicked against the cold marble floor as faces turned, mouths fell silent, and the past came rushing back with a vengeance. Her name? Emily Carter. And her return was the beginning of an unraveling no one could stop. Emily Carter hadn't stepped foot in her hometown for over a decade. Each mile that brought her closer had felt like a knot tightening in her stomach, a silent warning that the ghosts of the past were waiting. She was 17 the day she fled, her face pressed against the car window, watching the only life she'd ever known blur behind streams of tears. Her father, Reverend Jonathan Carter, had been the town's moral compass, the man people trusted with their darkest sins and deepest hopes. But overnight, that image had collapsed under the weight of scandal. Accused of misconduct with a member of the congregation, his reputation was dragged through the mud by gossip, half-truths, and headlines. No charges were filed, no evidence confirmed the rumors, but the damage was irreparable. Emily became collateral damage. At school, friends stopped looking her in the eye. At the grocery store, strangers whispered just loud enough for her to hear. The pain wasn't just public, it was personal. Her father, once her hero, grew distant and quiet, buried under shame. So when her mother packed their bags and urged her into the car, Emily didn't fight. She didn't say goodbye. She only promised herself she'd never come back. And yet here she was. 10 years older, stronger in some ways, but still haunted. Standing at the edge of the church steps for his funeral, Emily could barely breathe. The place looked smaller than she remembered, but the judgment in the eyes that turned toward her felt just as heavy. A woman clutched her husband's arm and turned away. An old man whispered something behind a raised bulletin. Emily's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. Dressed in black, her hands clenched tight at her sides, she walked forward with purpose. She wasn't just here to mourn. She needed answers. She needed to know what really happened all those years ago, and whether her father was the man she had loved, or the man the town had condemned. Inside the church, Emily felt as if she had stepped into a forgotten dream, one wrapped in silence, grief, and ghostly memories. The once familiar sanctuary had aged, much like her, weathered by time and truths too heavy to carry. Dust clung to the edges of the stained glass windows, dulling the colors that used to dance on Sunday mornings. The scent of wax, lilies, and aging wood enveloped her, evoking an ache so deep it stole her breath. Her footsteps echoed through the long aisle, measured and slow, yet every step felt like she was walking against a tide of unspoken accusations. She didn't need to look around to know that eyes were following her, judging, questioning, remembering. Her gaze locked on the simple casket at the altar, draped in white like a final, desperate attempt to purify a story stained by pain. The man inside was once her hero, Pastor Samuel Miller, a father whose words healed others but somehow never reached his own daughter. He had died quietly, heart stopped in a house filled with silence, surrounded by no one. A cruel, lonely end for a man who had once stood at this very altar, commanding crowds with compassion in his voice and conviction in his soul. Emily's throat tightened. She slowed as she approached the casket, her chest rising and falling with effort, as if the air itself resisted entering her lungs. Memories hit her like waves, his arms lifting her high after her first school recital, his voice reading her psalms before bed, the quiet disappointment in his eyes when she challenged the church's silence on injustice. Her hand lifted instinctively, fingers grazing the edge of the coffin, and in that cold, polished wood she felt everything she never got to say. Her lips trembled, but she swallowed the tears. Crying here would mean giving them something to talk about, again. Just then, a quiet voice broke through the thick silence. "Emily." She turned. Pastor Raymond Nichols stood just behind her, older now, silver strands in his hair, his eyes softened by time but weary with memory. His presence was gentle but guarded. He had once stood beside her father, back when sermons were still safe and families unbroken. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, offering a sad smile. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, guarded behind a wall she'd spent years building. "Neither did I," she replied, voice low, but steady. Pastor Nichols nodded thoughtfully, his gaze shifting to the people behind her, the congregation who had watched her grow up, and who later watched her fall out of grace. "There's a lot of history in this room," he said. "Some of it, complicated." Emily's eyes flickered, scanning the faces. Some were curious. Some resentful. A few were simply confused. But none of them knew the full truth. None of them had lived it. "I'm not here for them," she said firmly, her voice carrying more weight than she intended. Pastor Nichols stepped beside her, not pressing, just present. "Then why are you here?" Emily turned back toward the casket, her hand still resting lightly on its surface. Her voice was barely audible, but every word was laced with pain. "Because I need to know if the man they buried was really the man I lost. Or just the one they chose to remember." Emily stood motionless at the back of the church, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the pew in front of her, the wood pressing into her skin. The casket before her, now surrounded by a sea of flowers, seemed almost out of place in its starkness, too clean, too polished for the man she had known. The man she had never truly understood. The man whose expectations had shaped every decision, every path she had taken in life, even though he had never once seen her for who she really was. His face, cold and distant in the photograph framed beside the casket, stared back at her as though daring her to be something more than the rebellious daughter who had turned her back on everything he stood for. The air felt thick with tension, stifling the space around her. Every inch of the church seemed to press against her, from the cold marble floors beneath her feet to the stained glass windows high above her head, casting fragmented light across the room. It was the same church where she had spent her childhood, the same one that had preached the values of obedience, respect, and unwavering faith. And yet, it felt like a prison now, a cage built from the very teachings she had been forced to accept as truth, the very teachings that had stifled her voice for years. She glanced around at the familiar faces in the crowd. They were all watching her, waiting for her to fall in line. She could see the judgment in their eyes, the pity disguised as concern, the disappointment that had been simmering beneath their surfaces for years. They didn't understand. They didn't know what it felt like to grow up with a father who demanded perfection and demanded silence when it came to the cracks in their family's foundation. They didn't know what it was like to feel suffocated by the very air you breathed, to live in constant fear of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing. The fear of disappointing him had shaped her entire childhood, until she had finally been forced to leave. Her breath hitched as she stepped forward, the path to the altar feeling impossibly long. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, a tight knot of anger and confusion twisting in her stomach. Each step felt like a battle, one part of her urging her to walk forward, to fulfill the role she had been expected to play for so many years, and another part pulling her back, telling her that she didn't owe anyone this. She didn't owe anyone the facade of a perfect daughter, the obedient child who conformed to the image of what they all wanted her to be. Her chest tightened as the memories flooded back, uninvited, filling the silence with their harsh truths. The years of sitting quietly at the dinner table, biting her tongue, holding back her thoughts, her feelings, all to avoid the wrath of her father. The years of trying, desperately, to earn his approval, only to be met with cold indifference. the years of watching her mother silently suffer under his control, unable to escape the grip of the expectations that had shackled their family. She had grown up in that house, but she had never been allowed to truly live there. She had never been allowed to be herself. The anger swelled inside her, hot and burning. How could he have never seen her? How could he have never known how much she had suffered under the weight of his demands? How could he have thought that all of this life, this silence, was the right way? Was this what he had wanted for her? A life of hiding, of pretending to be someone she wasn't? Emily. The soft voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her out of the whirlwind of her emotions. She turned to face Pastor Nichols, who was standing a few feet away, his eyes searching hers with an unreadable expression. He had been there for her in so many ways, guiding her when she was a child, offering support when she had fled the church all those years ago. And now, in this moment, he seemed like a ghost of the past, a reminder of the man her father had wanted him to be, the man who had never questioned anything. Emily, he repeated, his tone soft yet insistent. You don't have to do this. You don't have to carry this burden alone. Her throat tightened. She swallowed hard, but the lump wouldn't go away. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've carried it for so long. This pain. This anger. And now, with him gone, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Pastor Nichols stepped closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder but not quite touching. You don't have to forgive him. Not now. Not until you're ready. But you need to allow yourself to feel everything you've been keeping inside. If you don't, you'll never move forward. She shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I don't know how to let go, she confessed, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I don't know how to stop feeling like I'm just broken. Like nothing I ever did was enough. The pastor's expression softened, and he nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he let on. Healing doesn't happen overnight. And it certainly doesn't happen in a church. It happens in the silence, in the rawness of facing your truth, whether that's forgiveness, anger, or something else entirely. You can't run from it, Emily. You have to confront it. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now, the weight of his words sinking in deeper than anything else had. He was right. She had spent so many years running, burying her feelings beneath layers of duty and expectation. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending. Time to stop hiding from the anger, the hurt, the grief that had been festering inside her for so long. Taking a deep breath, Emily squared her shoulders and wiped the tears from her face. I'm not sure if I'll ever forgive him, she said quietly, but I'm going to try. For me. As Emily made her way down the aisle, each step felt heavier than the last. The soft murmur of the congregation faded into a dull hum, and the only sound that filled her ears was the pounding of her heart, loud, insistent, as if trying to break free from her chest. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to be feeling. The sorrow everyone else seemed to carry in their eyes wasn't hers. Instead, there was a deep emptiness that stretched out before her like an abyss. She reached for the pew in front of her, her hand trembling slightly as she grasped the wood, steadying herself. The casket lay ahead, so final, so cold. It was a thing that could never be undone. She swallowed hard, forcing her feet forward despite the urge to turn back. It was strange, how the very act of being here felt like a betrayal of herself. She had spent years distancing herself from this moment, from the man lying in that box, the father who had failed her in more ways than she could count. A cold shiver ran down her spine, not from grief, but from the suffocating weight of it all. She could almost feel his disapproving gaze on her, as though his presence still haunted her, demanding something she didn't know how to give. Her throat tightened as memories began to surface, memories she had buried beneath layers of anger and hurt. She saw him again, her father, sitting at the head of the table, his eyes sharp, always evaluating, always measuring her. "Do better," he would say, "you're not trying hard enough." Those words, always just beneath the surface of her thoughts, haunted her to this day. The cruel irony of it all was that he never understood her, never truly saw her, not as she was, not as she wanted to be. He saw a reflection of his own ambitions in her, a project to be molded, perfected, shaped to fit his narrow vision of success. But that wasn't her. Not really. She had tried so desperately to meet his expectations, to earn the love he never freely gave, but no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. She had pushed herself to the brink, twisted herself into someone she wasn't, just to hear the faintest praise, the smallest acknowledgement. And yet, in the end, he never even saw her for who she was. Now, standing before his lifeless body, Emily realized just how much she had lost in her quest to be what he wanted. The dream of being his perfect daughter, one he would be proud of, had shattered long ago, but she had never allowed herself to mourn it. Instead, she had buried it, hidden it behind walls of resentment and pride. The bitterness she felt now wasn't just toward him, it was also toward herself. How could she have spent so many years trying to please someone who had never even seen her? Her breath caught in her chest as her eyes locked on the casket. The finality of it was unbearable. She wanted to scream, to shout at him for all the years he had stolen from her, for the part of her she had sacrificed just to survive under his constant scrutiny. The anger burned inside her like a wildfire, hot and relentless. She couldn't forgive him. She didn't even know if she wanted to. And yet, as she stood there, with her brother's gaze on her back, she felt a flicker of doubt. Jake, her brother, the golden child, was already standing near the casket, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression tight with grief. Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the unspoken plea in his eyes. He wanted her to mourn, to grieve, to do what was expected of them. But she couldn't. Not when all she felt was anger, confusion, and a deep, aching sorrow that she didn't know how to name. Her fingers tightened around the pew, nails digging into the wood as if grounding herself. She had never been good at showing weakness, not to anyone, and especially not to Jake. They had always been so different, so estranged in their experiences of their father. Jake, with his quiet obedience, had always been the one to seek approval, to bury his own needs for the sake of family harmony. Emily had always resisted, fought against the mold that their father tried to force her into, but in doing so, she had built walls between herself and everyone else. Now, as she met Jake's eyes across the room, she felt that distance more acutely than ever. "Emily," Jake called softly, his voice carrying through the tension in the room. She could hear the tremble in it, the weight of his plea. He was standing by the casket now, waiting for her, his face strained with expectation. He needed her to mourn, to honor their father in the way everyone else had. But how could she? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She didn't know how to explain to him the storm raging inside her, the conflicting emotions that had no place in this sacred space. "I can't, Jake," she finally whispered, her voice cracking with the rawness of it. "I can't pretend. Not today." Her brother's face faltered, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand. "You don't have to pretend, Emily. We have to move on. We owe him that." But Emily shook her head slowly, the weight of her words heavy on her tongue. "No, Jake. We owe him nothing. He never gave us what we needed. His love was conditional, his approval impossible to earn. We don't owe him anything." The silence between them was thick, like the air before a storm. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but she saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. He understood, perhaps not fully, but in that moment, he knew. She wasn't like him. She couldn't be. She couldn't be the person who silently carried the weight of their father's failures without confronting it, without confronting him. And so, Emily turned away from him, her heart heavy, her body stiff with tension. She walked toward the casket, feeling the eyes of the congregation burning into her back. The anger still churned inside her, but now, there was something else, something softer, something she hadn't expected. It was grief, a quiet, gnawing grief for the father she had never had and the person she might have been if things had been different. But she couldn't allow herself to feel that yet, not until she could face the truth of what she had lost, not just him, but the pieces of herself she had given up in the process. Emily stood motionless, her body trembling slightly as she gazed down at the casket before her. The room, once filled with familiar faces, had fallen eerily quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. The smell of flowers, so sweet and innocent, filled the air, but it felt suffocating to her, like the heavy weight of grief pressing down on her chest. She had been here for what felt like an eternity, yet the reality of the moment hadn't fully settled in. Her father was gone. The man who had shaped so much of her life, who had defined her sense of self for years, was now just another body in a box. Her eyes lingered on the casket, but her mind was elsewhere. Memories, sharp and painful, played through her mind like a montage she couldn't escape. Her childhood, filled with the expectation of perfection, never enough, always falling short of his unreachable standards. She remembered how, as a little girl, she had eagerly awaited his praise, a simple acknowledgement that she was worthy of his love. Instead, she had received nothing but disappointment, coldness, and an ever-present sense that she wasn't quite what he wanted her to be. No matter how hard she tried, she was never enough for him. Never enough to fill the emotional void that seemed to surround him like a dark cloud. Her breath hitched in her throat as a wave of bitterness surged inside her. She had tried to let go of that resentment for years, tried to forgive him, tried to find peace. But now, standing in this room with his lifeless body before her, the anger came rushing back. It burned through her veins, hot and furious. He had never really seen her, not for who she was, not for what she had become. To him, she was just another failure, another disappointment. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into the palms of her hands. The pain, physical and emotional, was overwhelming. The ache in her chest was too much to bear, but it was nothing compared to the emotional war that had waged for years. And now, standing here, at the threshold of an end that was both final and unresolved, Emily felt an urgency inside her. A need to move forward, to break free from the chains that had bound her to her father's expectations, to his cold indifference. Her mind swirled with conflicting emotions, anger, sorrow, confusion. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of feelings, none of them easily understood, none of them offering her comfort. She wanted to scream, to unleash every ounce of her pent-up frustration, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped behind the thick walls of her grief, stuck in a place where they could never escape. She took a tentative step forward, her body trembling as she reached out and touched the edge of the casket. The cold, lifeless surface beneath her fingertips sent a chill up her spine. The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. This was it. This was the end of a relationship that had never truly been one. She could feel the years of unresolved emotions, the layers of pain, the years of trying and failing, all pressing down on her shoulders. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of something deep within her, something raw and untapped. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a recognition. A recognition that perhaps, in his own broken way, he had never been able to offer her what she had needed. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how. His inability to connect with her, to see her, was a reflection of his own pain and failures, not a reflection of her worth. And in that realization, Emily felt a strange, quiet kind of release. Her hands trembled, but now, she was no longer shaking with anger. She was shaking with something else, something much harder to grasp. Grief, yes. But also the heavy weight of letting go. Letting go of the anger, of the resentment, of the need for him to be something he never could be for her. She had been holding on to that for so long, and now, here at the edge of his death, she had to make a choice. With a deep breath, she whispered under her breath, "Goodbye, Dad." The words were barely a whisper, but they felt like a release. She had said goodbye to a man who had never truly known her, but in saying that final goodbye, she had also said goodbye to the version of herself that had always sought his approval, the version of herself that had spent so many years trying to fill an empty space inside her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of anger or frustration. They were tears of release, of acceptance. Slowly, as if each step was a monumental decision, Emily turned away from the casket. She had been tied to him for so long, tied to his expectations, his disappointments, and his silence. But now, with him gone, she was free. She walked out of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. As she crossed the threshold and stepped into the world outside, the air felt different. It felt more open, more alive. There was pain, yes. But there was also a glimmer of something else, hope, perhaps. Hope for a future that was no longer defined by the shadow of a man who had never truly seen her. The door closed behind her, and in the quiet of the moment, Emily knew one thing for sure: she would no longer shrink. She would no longer hide. She would face her future, with all its uncertainties and pain, on her own terms. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. When Emily walked away from that funeral, she wasn't the same girl who had left in tears 10 years ago. She had looked her accusers in the eye, faced the shadows of her past, and unearthed the secrets they tried so hard to keep buried. In doing so, she reclaimed more than her name, she reclaimed her power. The truth didn't set everyone free, but it set her soul on fire. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the graves and guilt, Emily knew one thing for certain: she had buried the lies, not the love.